All right, welcome to week 2 of our Intro to the Ancient Near Eastern course. I want to just take a few moments and wrap up week 1 and then introduce some key things for this coming week. Week 1 was focused on two primary things. One was why study the Ancient Near East. The other one was the introduction to Mesopotamia in the 4th and 3rd millennia. So looking at why studying the Ancient Near East, of course you read some pieces by Martin Luther King Jr., Christopher B. Hayes, one of our faculty here at Fuller, and then William W. Hallow, who is kind of one of the important and dominant voices in the study of the ancient Near East over the past several decades. All of those articles, all of those chapters described a number of reasons for why studying the ancient Near East is important. And many of these things were drawn out in your online discussions, and I'd like to highlight a few. Some of the discussions focused on the issue of myth. For some of you, you put it in terms of legendary truth versus historical truth, or theological truth versus historical truth. And the discussions were very good, and I appreciate the engagement that each of you put into the discussions. And I maybe offer a definition of myth. A myth as a story of origin that provides meaning and identity for a community. One of the things that you'll find me discussing during the course is the idea of cultural memory or collective memory. That is, each culture forms a meaningful past for themselves. And a meaningful past, a cultural memory, are pieces or stories that cultures and communities craft for themselves, which are, for the most part, based in the past, based on things and people that are in that culture's past, but aren't necessarily historical or factual truth, as if most of us can even get to that. We have cultural memory in our families, in our communities, in our denominations, in our nation. And most of the past, as you saw in the video that I posted last week, is inaccessible. We can't access what actually happened, but we can access the identity-forming and meaningful past that communities craft for themselves. And that's what we find in much of ancient Near Eastern texts and literature. But what we'll also find, though, is that there's a multiplicity of genres in the ancient Near East. Myth is just one of these. We'll encounter legal texts. We will encounter, this week we'll look at creation narratives. We'll look at prophetic literature. We'll look at poetry. We'll look at historiographical documents. So we need to define each genre very specifically and understand how that fits into the overall picture that we're crafting for the ancient Near East and the Old Testament. Another issue that came up was the idea of comparing and contrasting, and this is one of the things that Hallow talked about and Dr. Hayes talked about in terms of the comparative approach. Comparison, really, I want you to think about comparison as really a fundamental aspect of life. As young babies, humans learn to compare and contrast. You learn your mother from your father. You learn red from blue. And it's important to understand that the comparative method involves both understanding similarities and differences. And as some of you pointed out, being able to compare very accurately and in detail allows you not only to see how things differ and how things are similar, but it clarifies what we see. Meaning, if we can't compare and contrast, if we don't have that ability, then we don't understand really what makes anything distinct. And so the comparative method that we will be using throughout the course will ask you to find both similarities and differences, and then articulate what those say about the various texts and things that we read. And so just the comparative method is going to be important for this course. And one of the other things that some of you brought up in your online discussions was the idea of immersing yourself in the cultural context of the Old Testament. And that's one of the things that this course is going to have you do. Think of it as if you are a missionary. Think of it as if you are in another culture, and how you would want to immerse yourself in that other culture. If you're a missionary, and I think that the most effective missions are long-term missions in which people get to know the culture, the language, the history, and all of the nuances in order to effectively bring the gospel to that particular culture. And I would say very much the same thing is if you're a visitor in the world of the Old Testament. This is not the 500 BC. We're not ancient Israelites, and so in order to understand the Old Testament, we need to understand the larger world from which it came, and that means understanding the language. For some of you taking Hebrew or other ancient languages. We need to understand the culture, which means reading widely and broadly and deeply in the texts that surround the Old Testament, and then learning the history, which is why history is a significant portion of this course, and 2 of your textbooks will bring you through the history of the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt. But if you can think about it like that, being a missionary in Old Testament times, that might give you some insight into how you need to immerse yourself in the culture of the Old Testament and the ancient Near East in order to really understand the message that the Old Testament has, not only had for its original audiences, but has for us as well. And then you were introduced to the comparative method and Mesopotamia, early Mesopotamia. Your first assignment was on the birth accounts of Moses and Sargon. And one of the things that I'd like to ask you just to reflect on, again, is who benefits from Moses' birth account. Consider that if there's a parallel here between Sargon the first and Sargon the second in the Sargon birth legend, that maybe there's somewhat of a similarity between Moses and the Levites, meaning the Levites might have benefited from having a founder who kind of had a rags to riches story, was elevated. Remember who's Moses' parents are. They're Levites. And remember that Moses institutes the Levitical system in ancient Israel, according to the book of Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus. Anyway, so that's something to ponder. Now let me introduce week 2. So week 2, we're going to back up a little bit. We're going to shift the geographic focus from Mesopotamia to Egypt, and we're going to cover the 4th and 3rd millennia in ancient Egypt as well, and an introduction to ancient Egypt. You're also going to do some comparative analysis or discussion on creation accounts, and I look forward to how this discussion evolves. And then you're going to do a comparative assignment focusing on ancient Near Eastern iconography. Now, one of the things I want you to consider is that the ancient world was more of a visual culture than a textual culture. Very few people in the ancient Near East could read, maybe 1 to 3% of the ancient Near East. And if you consider maybe functional literacy, people can read a name here and there, maybe a few words, then maybe you could say that more people were literate than that. But for high literacy, the texts mainly that we're reading in this course, very, very few people in the ancient Near East would have been able to read these texts. Now, of course, this is not considering oral tradition and the oral telling of these stories. Many more people probably would have known about the creation account than could read it on a piece of parchment or papyrus or whatever. But in terms of impact, the visual culture of the ancient Near East had a much more significant impact on the people. And so what I want to introduce you to is not only textual comparison, literary comparison, but also iconographic comparison. And the Old Testament, if you read it closely, is a very visual literary text. There's a lot of metaphor and a lot of visual verbal imagery that is grounded in and is based on visual imagery that people in the ancient Near East would have been accustomed to, and most of these on things like seals, stamp seals, and cylinder seals, which I'll post a short video of later in the quarter. But what I want you to do is really focus on immersing yourself in the Old Testament this week, understanding the large trends as you read Van der Merup's texts, so the development of writing, large cultural aspects that he points out, issues of geography and understanding where things happen, and then dates of key events and key figures. Now, you're not going to remember every detail of these two texts, but if you can focus on the large, broad brush, big wave top type things, I think you'll do yourself a service. And then focus on, again, the historical aspect of the ancient Near East. Where do the stories of the Old Testament fit in, or where would they fit in historically? And again, a lot of it isn't going to fit in until the last half of the course, but we're setting the stage now. And in fact, as we move into weeks 3 through 4, or 3 through 5, and we enter into the second millennium, a lot of the stories or really Genesis, those stories are kind of depicted and set in that context. And then also, again, focus on your comparative techniques, throughout this week. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I do respond very quickly, and I look forward to your engagement this week.